Many of you may have seen variations of this presentation, but what Beth and Lee really asked me to do is, as volunteer leaders, you may be asked by your chapter groups or other family members that what are we doing scientifically? And so it's kind of important, maybe I thought you might be interested in learning why we're doing some of the things we're doing and what the reason is behind some of these initiatives. So hopefully this presentation will highlight that. So I'll start off by kind of giving a brief overview of the drug development process, so we're all familiar with really what happens. And then we'll take a little nostalgic look back of 2019 when I joined in the first industry collaborative meeting we had, where we identified the various gaps in clinical trial readiness. And then the plan that we put forward and what we're doing and why we think it's important and the progress that we're making in that space. So if you have any questions, please ask me, feel free to interrupt. So the drug development process, usually, this is taken from our webpage, it's depicted as kind of a very linear path. You start off with some basic research. I don't even know what, sorry, I can't see. The IND enabling studies, so this is all the toxicology, manufacturing stuff, and then it goes into clinical trial. And it just looks like it starts and stops at very, there's a start and an end for every one of these, and it just progresses in a very linear fashion. That's not really how it happens. It's actually very convoluted. A lot of things happen at the same time. There's actually a lot of overlap during the drug development process. A lot of the clinical stuff starts, during the very early phases of it. So the way I'd like to depict it is using this graphic where you can see it's really not linear. There's, you can look at that there's little troughs and valleys, there are hurdles, there are things that speed up that are pretty routine to do, and some things that are, there's holes in there, there's divots where you have to kind of climb your way out of it. So looking at this model of drug development, the early discovery, this is kind of, it's based on our knowledge of the basic understandings of FSHD. And this is when a company decides, now how are we going to intervene and stop FSHD from progressing? This is where some of the early tools are made, the cell lines and from the biopsies and assays, early assays. The formulation and development, this is the part where how are you going to deliver the therapeutic agent? Is it stable? These are manufacturing process. That's kind of what goes into that. So the pharmacology, it looks at the tissue distribution. Does the drug enter the muscle? Is it stable? How is it cleared? What's the half-life of the drug? Those are the kind of studies that happen there. And then toxicology, it's basically about safety. So they do a lot of safety studies in animal models, long-term exposures, just to see, what is the limit of a new drug, because before it goes into any human volunteer, they need to know that it's going to be safe. And this is where larger animal models can come into play. And then in the clinical trial, so once all of this happens, the FDA grants them, if you pass all of these hurdles, then you apply to the FDA and you get an investigational new drug application that allows you to start clinical trials. So the first in human type of trials. And the phase ones usually are short-term safety. So, anywhere from a handful to a dozen volunteers. Sometimes they're healthy, a lot of college students, they do a lot of trials in college students for a little extra cash. People volunteer and they get injected with unknown drugs to see how safe they are. But quite often, the short-term safety can also be in the patient volunteering. And they look at short-term exposure or escalating doses. Just safety as the primary concern here. If that passes, then you go into phase 2 with the longer-term safety. So you identify the dose you want to administer for maybe a longer time, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. And this is also an opportunity to really test some of the outcome measures. What's going to be your readout to show that the drug is effective? And so the phase 2 trials may have anywhere between 50 to 100 volunteers, and they're going to be quite demanding because you're going to go in there every month or every couple of months for a visit, and they're going to put you through a whole rigor of tests because they're trying to see what measure really shows progression or lack of progression. So it's quite demanding on the participants to be in a phase 2 study. And then the phase 3, if that passes and the drug looks to be safe and there are outcomes that are promising, then the company enters a phase 3, and this is when they're going to need several hundred volunteers, and their primary endpoint is they're looking for efficacy of the drug. And obviously safety is always being tracked, but that's really what they're doing. So this is kind of if all successful, then they apply for the FDA for a new drug application. And if the FDA sees that, or if they agree that the drug is effective, then they give approval, and then the drug can be marketed. So looking at this, drug development pathway, the society and other groups have, we've been funding a lot of grants with academic groups, just trying to understand the basic biology of FSHD. And this is kind of the entry point for drug discovery. How are you going to tackle the disease? What are the therapeutic interventions that people can develop? The next part is really, a lot of it is about the drug manufacturing process, stability. This is really, we're not in the drug development business. I've worked for organizations that do drug development. The society does not do drug development. This is really the property or the area where pharmaceutical companies really do this best. And however, to go into clinical trials, every company needs tools. They need biomarkers. They need to know how to measure disease progression. To run an effective clinical trial, you need that infrastructure. And also, in a rare disease space, access to patients and being able to get volunteers when you want to run a clinical trial really becomes essential. And so this is the area that we have been really focusing on with the Therapeutic Accelerator. These are the areas that we know for a pharmaceutical company to engage in a rare disease, they want to make sure that there's enough known about the disease, the natural history of it, that there are instruments and tools that they can tap into in their clinical trials, that there's a solid infrastructure where they can run clinical trials, and that there is a willing and able patient population that's going to come forward if they're being asked to volunteer for a study. And so this is really what we're focusing on in the Therapeutic Accelerator. So, how do we, and these are really where a lot of the gaps are also in drug development. So how did we kind of get to understand, what are the major gaps? What are the common things that companies need to solve to really move the drug forward? Well, this is kind of borrowing from the social capitalism. You get them together in a room and you kind of start asking industry, what do you need? And lo and behold, all of them more or less need the same things. And so once they hear that they all are looking for the same kind of tools, they're looking for the same kind of infrastructure, it makes it a lot easier to get them to collaborate together. So in 2019, the society organized the first industry collaborative meeting, and we invited a lot of the regulatory agencies, because the regulatory agencies don't know anything about FSHD. We don't want them to use their knowledge of, let's say, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and apply those metrics when they're evaluating the drug in FSHD. Very different diseases. So we got them in the room. We got pharmaceutical companies that were kind of looking, that we knew were interested in the space. Maybe they're working on other neuromuscular indications, but they didn't have any firm commitments in FSHD. And then the ones that we knew were actively engaged in FSHD. And we were trying to make the disease tractable, make it appealing for these new companies to enter the field. And we also wanted to hear for those who were already in the field, what were the gaps? What are the things that you're going to need to really be effective? And so, this is the outcome of the workshop, was really to try to identify these gaps. So, we all know that, I just mentioned tools. They all wanted biomarkers, either they're molecular biomarkers or imaging biomarkers. They wanted to have really good measures of disease progression so they could track the effectiveness of a drug. They really were looking for a solid infrastructure. They could run drug trials throughout the US and across the world. So it's not enough to have clinical trial sites in the US. They also want to run international trials. And they also, really need to make sure that the community is going to be engaged and will volunteer and come forward when the trials come forward. And the FDA at that point told us that the way they learn about a disease is they want to hear directly from the community. They don't want pharmaceuticals to tell them what the patient community needs. They want to hear directly from the patient community, and they've created this platform that I was not aware of called the Externally Led Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting. We call that Voice of the Patient meeting. And that's how they really want to learn about the disease. And to understand more about the natural history of the disease, we talk about registries. Every country is tracking progression in somewhat similar ways, but those have not been integrated. And so it would be really powerful if we could integrate data from across all of these different registries to really get a fair understanding of how the disease is progressing in a large group of patients. And one of the other impediments was really genetic testing. FSHD's genetics is very complex, and standard next generation sequencing, you can't use those techniques to identify FSHD. So there needed to be better methods, easier access to genetic testing. So basically, these are our marching orders, and so we started putting together. This is a new addition to the slide. Another benefit of this meeting is what really wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that new companies would be aware of our activities so they would enter the field, because we are not developing drugs. Really what we want to do is we would like to have as many shots on goal as possible, as many companies entering the field as possible, so we'll have multiple options and hopefully the more drugs and more therapeutics available to the community. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we did. Our focus here for biomarkers was really not to start from scratch, but try to do things as expeditiously as possible, move as quickly as possible, and learn from studies that have already happened. So as many of you may have already participated in Resolve or maybe the Redux studies, you may have undergone muscle biopsies. Those are pretty invasive. You can't do muscle biopsies every week. So ideally, it would be really useful if we could have a blood-based biomarker. And the pharma companies were very specific, and they wanted to have a biomarker that reported on DUX4 activity or DUX4 levels, because all of the therapeutic strategies out there are trying to lower DUX4 or lower DUX4 activity. So it's a very specific type of biomarker they're looking for, and that's what we set out to do. So we were building on existing knowledge, and ideally we don't want to develop an assay from scratch. We want to use a commercial assay, and we want to use an assay or a assay provider that would be available to the whole community, the whole research community. So if something is positive and we have a hit, then every pharmaceutical company can access it very easily. So, and then we went after the low-hanging fruit. So, based on published data. So we set up a biomarker workshop. I organized a team with a biostatistician and researchers, and we designed several different types of experiments that we outsourced to a contract research organization. And we got samples from Dr. Tawil and Dr. Statland. We got samples from Fulcrum Therapeutics to kind of test out our hypothesis. Unfortunately, the two studies didn't pan out, but those were the low-hanging fruits. So going forward, we're now have to reach a little bit higher. The experiments are going to be a little bit more complex, but we're going to get more industry collaborations, and we're going to be reaching out to them for help and to design these larger, more comprehensive studies. And we're doing very similar things with the MRI. There's a lot of MRI studies have been ongoing. Historical longitudinal imaging studies have taken place, but the data have not been integrated. And so what we're looking to do is seeing if we can get some of the studies pulled together and then reanalyzed with the latest techniques. And so those are some of the approaches that we are taking. Infrastructure, we heard yesterday, yep, was that a question?
Oh, no, sorry.
All right. We heard yesterday about the Clinical Trial Research Network. I think June mentioned the society provided some of the seed funding to get it started. They once it got started, there was funding from NIH, FDA, pharmaceutical companies, and it expanded. And we had heard from pharmaceutical companies that that's a really useful network to have. So we added 4 more sites to it. And now I think the Solve FSHD is adding sites in Canada. There are other international sites in Europe and possibly Australia and maybe even Hong Kong that are being considered. And they've been carrying out some really important studies to look for outcome measures. So the RESULT study is coming to a conclusion. This was a 2-year longitudinal study testing a battery of outcome assessments that can be used in the clinic to show efficacy. And I think Michaela is going to talk about Move and Move Plus. Are you going to talk about that today?
No.
Okay, sorry. I didn't look at sorry. So there's a new study that kind of got started where they're validating some of these outcome measures. And that's also a very important study that's moving forward. So, obviously, clinical trials, we have multiple clinical trials happening in tandem, we may need additional sites, and this is something we're looking into. Can we expand this network even more by adding just trial sites where there are hubs of patient volunteers just to expedite the recruitment into trials? I've already mentioned the voice of the patient, meaning this is what the FDA asked us to set up so they would learn about the disease. Thank you for all of you. I think a lot of you participated in this. It was really amazing. In the middle of the pandemic, we were able to organize this virtual meeting. We had over 400 participants. It was just a phenomenal event. And basically a report was generated that was sent to the FDA. And we can continue engaging with the FDA on very specific topics, but this type of approach really needs to be well thought out and planned in advance because they have to be very purposeful and in nature, and we want to make sure that they get the right message is conveyed to the FDA, because if they misunderstand the purpose of it, it could actually confuse them, and then it's going to make approval of drugs even more complicated. So the natural history integration, this is really trying to better understand the progression of the disease. And so we looked at different ways of doing this. I'm sure a lot of you have participated in these surveys. They ask a lot of questions. You have to answer a lot of different things. When those surveys are analyzed, they don't necessarily incorporate all of the answers into an analysis. There's only so many variables that you can track when you're doing a manual analysis. So the approach we wanted to do was to use machine learning and artificial intelligence so you can actually use all of the data that's being collected. It also makes it easier if you're trying to compare a registry that maybe is using a 1 to 10 scale versus another registry that's asking the same questions with yes/no answers. You kind of need that machine learning to kind of be able to overlay the answers that may be answered in different ways. And really, we wanted to also tap into historical clinical data. So there's been multiple clinical trials run by pharmaceutical companies, and maybe they weren't successful, so they abandoned the program. Those trials, they collected a lot of information that they're just sitting in their drawers and nobody's really using it. And we've learned from the Duchenne's field that if we can actually tap into that, you can learn how to design better clinical trials. So this is kind of what we wanted to do. One of the first things we did is we funded a small pilot study using AI, using the US patient registry to see if they could incorporate all the data that they collect and learn something new. And that was published. What was really interesting is about a year later, a group in China used a very similar method to analyze their registry. I actually did not know that there was a patient registry in China. So it stimulated other groups to kind of use similar approaches. The other thing we did is we contracted with a company, an AI company, to look at the Resolve study. So the natural history study that the CTRN was running for 2 years, we got this company to upload all of the data, and they are now looking to see if there are trends, if they can maybe look, identify patient groups that may be progressing faster or slower. This is going to be very important. If you can identify subgroups of patients with different trajectories, you can build better clinical trials. And the last thing we did is we set up a partnership with the Critical Path Institute. This is a group funded by the FDA, and they've created this engine where they can take clinical data from trials and learn from it, so it'll be helpful in designing new clinical trials, better trials that are more sensitive. They use that in Duchenne's, and we're contacting the different pharmaceutical companies. It's has to go through legal of these pharma companies, so it's a really painful process, but we're having success. There was a trial run by Wyeth many years ago. Wyeth was purchased by Pfizer. I've had to go through the whole Pfizer legal system, and I think they are giving the green light that they're going to release the data, hopefully. And then we're speaking with companies that are running trials now to make sure that they will make their data available when their trials are over. So we can always learn from ongoing trials and improve future ones. All right, test FSHD. I think that's something that you're probably familiar with. The purpose really was to open up testing and make it more available and easier genetic testing, so the community that is interested in participating in trials would have that confirmed clinically approved genetic test, which tends to be a requirement for all ongoing trials right now. So what we did was we set up a funding opportunity. So these pharmaceuticals generously provide us funding so we could set up this infrastructure, and it was very successful. We launched this pilot program for 150 patients, and I think we opened it in mid-April, and by November we had over 150 people that wanted to participate. What is really interesting, this is my only data slide. We have good representation between men and women. We have good representation of all the different age groups. These are the age groups in the bar graphs. Good representation from across the US. And the program is very successful. And now there's an infrastructure. So I'd say we don't get more money from pharmaceutical companies to keep this going. If they want to launch it on their own, if they're running a trial and there's a bottleneck, they can actually use that platform to provide more testing for their participants. Yes, Jack.
Jamshid mentioned that we structured that so that somebody will come out and draw their blood. Somebody will come to your house and draw your blood. We made it super easy, right?
Yeah.
Yes. That was, initially we wanted to use LabCorp, and that didn't work out, so we used mobile phlebotomy. That was an option that one of the companies suggested, and it worked out really, really well.
Yeah.
By the way, just because we are fundraisers in this room, we match those dollars that the pharmaceuticals put in.
Yeah.
So we paid half, they paid half. That's how we arrived at that deal.
Yeah, thank you for that point. Yes. Very good. So this program was quite successful. I think there's interest now for us to not only continue the program in the US, but also there are other countries that are asking us to set up similar genetic testing programs in there. So the rules and regulations are different in every country, but we're trying to set up similar platforms and starting to. And then, over time, yes.
Jamshid, does that graph show that it was mostly females? Is that?
No, it's about 50-50.
Oh, okay. All right. I started to read the little.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
It is.
So there were other gaps that were identified. So one of the things that we found out is once a drug is approved, this is coming back to what Mark was talking about, the Project Mercury, is access. Like, just because a drug is approved doesn't mean that insurance companies are going to pay for it and reimburse for the drug. So, how do we get around that? Well, one of the important factors is how much does it cost? How much does living with FSHD cost the system, society, in loss of employment, in Medicare, and all of that, in health bills? So we ran this study, and thank you to all of you who participated in this. We sent out a survey to not only capture your medical costs, but also the indirect costs. So the employment or caregiver costs or modifications to your home, all the things that insurance doesn't reimburse. We also got claims data from Optum and United Healthcare. So this is actually all the claims data with, and Jim mentioned the ICD-10 code. We were able to collect all of that information, and now we're creating a report that will really show what it costs to live with FSHD. And
Jamshid, can I just ask you a quick question? Do you happen to know what the N is on the claims data?
It's very similar to the survey. I think it was a little under 400, right? Yeah.
Which, by the way, what we understand is even 100 participants in a survey would be a significant enough number.
Yeah.
Our community has responded very, very well. And you just made that sound really simple, but I'm going to give a shout out to you and the team, because they had to craft and then have the language checked on all of the things. We had to get an IRB approval, because this is a published study. This is not, a survey we developed overnight and just threw it all out there. So kudos to you guys. You made it.
I'm not the privileged person to come up here and tell you about this work, but behind the scenes, June, Amanda Hill did an amazing job crafting the survey. I don't know, we had something like 20 versions of the survey that went back and forth, and we kept editing it until it finally went out for IRB approval before we sent it out. So it was, I think it took a long time to pull together. And this was a brand new survey. We learned from other neuromuscular diseases. Develop it from scratch, but it was tailored exclusively for FSHD. And I think we also had a focus group that went through it and gave us input. So very well crafted survey. Yes.
Yeah.
Do we have any preliminary results?
We do, but we'd have to kill you. No, it's been done. Well, we hired a professional that's in this to do this.
We have two consultants. One of them helped us design the survey, and now we have a statistician that's going through these. But this is actually, coming from the survey itself, the 355 participants, the representation across the U.S., and also the households with 1, 2, or 3 FSHD patients in the family. So we have those numbers. Cost-wise, I think we have to do a lot of double checking before we'll release that. Hopefully in the International Research Congress in June, we're hoping to have a poster that has preliminary data in there. And then obviously we'd like to publish it, because once it's published, then pharma companies can use it to take it to the payers and to the insurance companies and kind of start the negotiation process there. So thank you very much for everybody who participated in this. The turnaround was absolutely amazing, and the response rate was really impressive. The other thing that we're doing is really trying to, so this is all kind of patient focused. Now on the other end, we're trying to also make sure there are more clinicians that are aware of FSHD. And just like the continuing medical education course, this is really June's work. She is updating the standards of care that were published. The last version of it was in 2015. We're updating these with the latest standards of care so clinicians can provide the best care possible using the latest findings. And so this is a very, very difficult task, because June is trying to get, I don't know, something like 30 clinician researchers to participate. 40. And if anybody has tried herding cats, this is how challenging this is, but it's moving very well.
We had a question yesterday about the CA course, June. Is it valid for doctors outside of the US? Do they get credit for
The
it?
credits are accepted in the EU countries.
Okay,
I looked and could not find any information on it about Canada.
okay,
I would think that it would be,
Yeah.
because these are kind of issued, these are American Medical Association approved credits. But I just absolutely could not find anything on.
Maybe repeat that for back in the room.
Oh, okay. So I was saying these credits are accepted by European medical associations, but I could not get any information on whether they're accepted in Canada. And they may well be. I would think they would be, because these are issued by the American Medical Association or accepted by AMA. But all the Googling, I just couldn't find that information.
So now this is the last topic. As I mentioned, one of our goals really is to try to get as many pharmaceutical companies engaged in FSHD research and therapeutic development as possible. So going back to 2019, when we had that industry collaborative meeting, those were the companies that came and participated. The ones in blue were the ones that we knew had an active program on FSHD. The ones in gray were either had abandoned their FSHD programs, or they were on the fence and they were looking at the space to see if this is something that they wanted to enter. Within a year, the landscape changed to this, and Fulcrum was really the only company that maintained their FSHD program. The other companies dropped out. They had clinical trials and it didn't work, and they kind of abandoned that program. So, this looks pretty grim. However, because of that type of infrastructure, and I think because a lot is known about the disease, and because of the network being in place, and because more outcome measures are being developed and being validated, we can look at the pharmaceutical company as a revolving door. So some may drop out, but other companies are coming in. So over the last 2 or 3 years, the number of companies in the space has grown to over 20. This is really remarkable. We have, and this is part of another presentation, but every possible therapeutic approach is being pursued for knocking down or silencing DUX4. So a lot of different strategies are at work. A lot of different companies are actively developing therapeutics. And there are also a lot more companies now entering the fold that are trying to rebuild muscle, which is something that a couple of years ago was really not, we didn't know about. Nobody was doing anything about. So, just in October, and this, our website keeps needing to be updated because more and more companies enter the fold. But in October of last year, Sanofi, which is a large French pharmaceutical company, partnered with Miracule, which is a small biotech company in Maryland. And this is a big deal because Sanofi has all the infrastructure to run clinical trials. And Miracule is a very small company with like 20 people in it. So that partnership is going to be really a good partnership, because they're going to be able to take the findings from Miracule and try to put a clinical trial behind it. Another really interesting thing was Avita Therapeutics that started, this company was formed maybe 3 or 4 years ago out of from an academic group at Kennedy Krieger. And it is now, they've raised $31 million and FSHD, and this is a cell therapy program to rebuild muscle. So very exciting. Just in this year, we've learned of, there's 2 other companies that are starting to work on FSHD and looking to rebuild muscle. I have a call next week with another company I know nothing about. They just kind of popped up. And most of the time, what's really exciting is early stage companies reach out to us because they want to know who are the experts in the field, what are the clinicians they can tap and talk to, what resources, what cell lines, animal models maybe they should be using. So we give them a lot of advice on maybe who they should talk to. We help them with designing of the experiments that they need to do as a proof of concept. But the other thing that's really important is they always want to know, like, can we talk to patients? Can we learn about the disease? So the companies are looking to connect with the community to learn what's important to them. And I have to say, 15 years ago, when I was working on Huntington's disease, that was not the case. smaller companies, medium-sized companies are really connecting with the community to learn what the patient community needs and making sure that the therapies that they're developing is going to be something that they're going to want. All right, if you have any more questions, I'll be here for another couple of hours. Feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to.